Hello, I'm Julie Gabrielli. This is part one of a three-part series on ideas of dwelling, which will inform our first project. One approach to designing housing is to think about the life of the home from really the inside out. So, what happens in the spaces that we're designing? And so for this first part one, I'm going to show a series of paintings of interiors that depict the intimacy of domestic life, the home as a place of protection, and then with very controlled and sometimes limited connections to the outside world. And so Dutch interiors, this is one, are a rich source of inspiration for this kind of exploration. This particular painting shows simple activities of daily life. And in this case, you can see from one room to the next room beyond. That's a pretty signature element of Dutch interiors. So you can kind of imagine the story there or the connection between these spaces. And they're very simple depictions of activities of daily life. In this case, someone is doing some chores, another person is maybe preparing some food. We don't know what the third person is doing because their hands are hidden from us, but we can imagine. And then we can also see outside in this kind of controlled way. We see trees and sky. And there's a lot of privacy, like the windows don't go down very low. Here's another one. And so this one is particularly rich for the series of layers of spaces from the foreground to the middle ground to the background. And we can see the bustling life all the way deep in the background on the left, the bustling life of the city street. There's someone sitting in the doorway. There are people passing by. So you can kind of imagine this sort of neighborly connection there. While meanwhile, if you pass through that entry hall into the inner sanctum of this house, which is where you see the two people more in the foreground, there's a lot of activity going on. There's food preparation. There's other kinds of chores. There's maybe a bird cage hanging there. And the people are having this kind of intimate conversation. Maybe she might be sewing, or there's a sewing basket somewhere in here. And you can also see in the upper left, there's a stairway landing. So you can imagine these spaces leading up to even more private rooms. And so there are these overlooks, there are views into and from spaces. And there's just a richness of experiences and connections. Like the window above the woman in the foreground is open, so you can imagine that she can hear. There's fresh air coming in, but you can hear what's going on the street. And the house is really a container of these experiences, whether it be work or leisure, cultural pursuits, intellectual pursuits. In this one, the piano lesson, we see both a piano and a cello. And then we can also, on the left, you can see natural light coming in that really casts a beautiful glow inside of that space, making it both making it usable, so that they can see there isn't any artificial light depicted in this painting. And there's a little bit in both of these, the one before, certainly you get a sense of how are these spaces made. You see ceiling beams, you see corbels of stone to hold the beams, you see the way the windows are framed, and same thing here in this one, you're seeing the beams and then this very geometric pattern of the floor that's also reflected in that mirror above the piano. This painting is by Leslie Groff, and as a kind of commentary on daily life, but also asking the question, how are the spaces of the home gendered? potentially. And so we see in here a woman sitting in a kitchen. We don't even see her head. So her identity seems to matter less than her function, which is doing something to prepare food. Pierre Bonnard is another painter who did a lot of interiors, richly textured with beautiful, vibrant color. And so getting at what are the qualities and the experiences of these places. In this one, you get a sense of almost isolation or disconnection or possibly loneliness. And even though the table is laid for what looks like it's going to be a pretty elaborate meal, the two people aren't looking at each other. They're not engaging at all, and there's a flatness to the space. We don't see anything but the table and the two people, and then a wall right behind them. So there's a certain mood that's implied there. Whereas these two, also by Bonnard, are really different in mood. Both of them have a direct connection to the outside. And, there's a sense maybe a little bit more playful, but also the two show the table laid with nourishing foods. But this idea of light and air and connection outside, and then into these domesticated spaces, whether they be garden or terrace. And in the one on the right, that sort of connection, that link between inside and outside is rather blurred. It's possible that the room itself is more of a porch than it is an interior space, like the one on the left is much more contained and defined. So that sort of line between inside and outside, how is it made? How is it experienced? In this painting, Jideka Crosby I have a few of hers showing domesticity in the diaspora, and sort of what is home for the expatriate. And there's a lot of provocative imagery here, and the definitions of the space are much more abstract, and there's this kind of direct indoor-outdoor blurring there. In this one, there's all of the pattern and color and layers of life, where the action is a very kind of intimate moment of drinking some tea, sitting quietly. There is a connection to the ancestors, perhaps with the portrait of maybe her parents, and the view beyond being something, again, almost like a jungle or certainly a very lush garden. In this one, there's a connection of one space to another, and then deeply even into a third, much like the Dutch interiors, this sort of mysterious door opening to this third space beyond. And interestingly, it's the same woman with the same dress. And so here she is in another part of her house, presumably. And then you can see the sort of connection of, or the collage of family members, both in the portrait of the woman with baby, but also on the wallpaper. There's someone being shown sideways. And in this one, really overtly, just a kind of collage of cultures where it's maybe talking about the home as a melting pot of cultures. And again, this sort of connection between the two spaces, the foreground space and the one in the background, and even deeply into, or further deep back into, an image of a space on a television set or that portrait is also, kind of another window into another world. David Hockney, a couple of paintings of his, how, in this one, kind of an exploration of how is that inner world defined and contained. There's a sense of, I guess, provisional privacy on the left, where this man is sitting at a little, almost like a card table desk behind a wall in a very kind of dim, protected space. And then on the right, that is much more exposed and connected to the world, the larger world of the garden and the backyard. And this idea of the house as a platform raised above the outside world. And so there's this very particular kind of base that he's showing with this, that sort of green material, and then a gravel foreground. But it's all made kind of theatrical with this curtain, as if all of it could just be closed off to the viewer at any moment. And this is another kind of intimate interior moment here. But the two don't seem to be quite at ease because they're sitting in these very hard kind of folding chairs that seem a little bit rickety and possibly temporary. And it makes you wonder what is going on. They seem to be ignoring each other. Or maybe they're just very comfortable in each other's presence. The man is obviously absorbed in what he's reading. The woman is looking right at us, as if she wants to know what we're doing, or she's about to ask us a question. And then the little mirror reflects the spaces behind us. And it hints that there's more to this than we are able to see in this view. And a kind of minimal take on how just a few objects can define a space. The rug, the table, the vase of flowers, the books. Henri Matisse did a bunch of interiors in Nice from his hotel rooms. And in this one, we're looking in a very unusual kind of vantage point, sort of above everything, looking down a little bit as well as out. So there's this sort of strange vantage point. But for our purposes, it's really showing this, again, this very direct connection between inside and outside, and inviting the sounds and the smells of the sea breezes coming in, and the light, a very special kind of light you have in a place like Nice. And then the objects of domesticity, right? The dressing table, the comfy chair, a little footstool, perhaps a mirror, and some curtains. These two are also Matisse, and just having a lot more color and texture than the previous painting, kind of connecting to the paintings of Crosby that we saw earlier. A lot of exuberant color and pattern. And then what is being seen outside of those windows? So you're looking on the one on the left, you're looking from a table in the foreground through to another room, and then through the windows that are in that room beyond, out into a view of a city or a town, and then even a mountain in the far, far background. You get the sense that the one on the right is also is a similar is the same room painted at a different time. So the table's now on the left, and there's more of a direct path from the foreground to the middle ground to the background, and then looking out that window. So how to engage the outdoors from within the apartment or the house, and even in a city apartment like this, how can we engage the outdoors from the inside? And then ending with a few Edward Hopper paintings. Hopper was a great one for, painting these tableaus that you can just imagine a whole story going on in here. How do the spaces facilitate relationships between people and between people and the world outside? And what can be seen from the outside looking in? So in this one, we are almost like a voyeur on the street, and we're seeing this tableau of an evening's activities, reading or making music. And when designing urban housing, we can be thinking about what it's like to be an individual person in this larger collective community of people in your building or in your neighborhood or in the city as a whole. Um, this like, is it possible to have privacy? Is it possible to have quiet and peace in certain places? And so in this painting, we're seeing the single woman sitting on a bed, looking out at the apartment building across the street, and all of those tiny repetitive windows. Um, each one might also have a woman on a bed looking out at the city. And you can wonder whether this painting is a picture of loneliness or is it a triumph of a woman living on her own? And this is another glimpse of life inside as seen probably from a window across the street looking in. And so there's a certain density of urban living that we have to contend with. And how within that do you maintain privacy? Because that filmy curtain isn't doing a very good job, and the shades aren't drawn all the way. One thought is that maybe the most private spaces, like bedrooms, could be located not on the street, but at the back, facing a quiet courtyard, perhaps, away from the noise and bustle of the city. And in this final slide, we see a quiet moment of reflection and contemplation in a sunlit window. And if you're familiar with Christopher Alexander's book, A Pattern Language, he writes in there about the bay window. And it's this kind of in-between space. It's like a porch, but in a bigger building, you can't really have a porch. So this is a way to have this sort of in-between space between the inside and the outside, and to let in light and air, even if you don't have a balcony. So in part two, House and World, we will look at the mythic aspects of house from history, imagination, and memory.